Welcome to Identirati Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and this is episode 5, Best Practices for Client Authentication, with guest Ralph Bragg, CTO of Raidiam. Welcome, Ralph.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
And Dick Hardt, founder of Hello.Coop and an author or editor of Authn RFC 6457. Which is it? I'm getting it wrong. 6459?
The Authn 2.
6749?
Yeah, the Authn 2, 6749. Yeah.
All right. Welcome, Dick. Thanks for joining us. So today, maybe, before we started, we were having an interesting conversation about the difference between client authentication at an OAuth server, authorization server, to get a token and actually presenting a token to an API or a resource server. Dick, maybe you could start there, because I thought that was a good differentiation to make so we don't conflate the two things.
Sure. Well, you had a wiki up around sort of what the topics were, and as I looked over it, it's all conflated, right? And so when you're making an API call, there's 4 ways that I can think of around how you authenticate. Well, there's actually a few other ways. So one of them would be just basic auth. You've got a username and password in the authorization header, and the API looks at that and decides whether it's correct or not to know which client is calling. And then you could also follow any of the OAuth practices of having it in a authorization header and a bearer token, which is the common thing, and then the new Depop standard where the client is proving possession of a key on every API call, so that no longer is the token just a bearer token. If somebody has it, they can make calls. At each API call that the client had possession of that. And then there's, of course, cookies, and a bunch of settings around cookies, and many REST APIs will also work against cookies. And then, of course, you could do other things like mutual TLS, as to how can the client prove who it is in making API calls. And all of that is separate from how does the client authenticate when calling the authorization server. And so in the OAuth standard, there's a number of different authorization mechanisms. You had a slide up there of sort of where Nat had called out the different ways.
I can share that right now.
Yeah.
This one, which I accidentally flipped to at the wrong time. Yeah.
But it's missing one of the flows that's also used in OAuth, which would be if you're only needing that authorization during a session, there's actually not a requirement for the client to authenticate if it's a public client, but just using the PKCE way of binding the initial session of the user to the API calls and the tokens, to the authorization code later on in the flow. And so in that, when you say none, it sounds like there's no authentication, but I'm proving that I'm the same party that started this flow that's completing this flow. So in many ways, it is an authentication for binding.
Right. And I wonder if that's just semantics. But I had a conversation with somebody recently about this. I can't remember who. And you're not really proving this client. So I think it's not really a PKC. It's not really a form of authentication. I've been thinking about it more like a state parameter. That maybe the state parameter checks it, that the client checks that it's still in the same conversation, and maybe the PKCE is the other way around, like a state parameter for the authorization server. But I would say it's not really you're not really proving that you're the entity associated with this client identifier. Ralph, maybe you have some thoughts on that. Do you get a lot of questions, ever get questions
Can I
about this?
respond on that first?
Please. I mean, you're the expert, so yeah.
Well, I have some expertise. If you go to just a website and you type in a username and password, and then you come back later and you type in a username and password, we call that authentication, right?
Yeah.
Right? But all you know is it's the same entity that was here last time that came back the second time. Agreed?
Yes.
Right. And so Pixie provides the same thing, that it's like, I'm proving I'm the client that started this flow, that's the one that's completing the flow. Now, which specific client, that might have been pre-registered or anything like that, well, you don't necessarily know all of that, right? But you definitely know it's the client that started the flow that's completing the flow, which in many ways is like, oh, I'm proving I'm the same one that started.
I mean, I agree with that. Ralph, any thoughts on Pixie?
Again, no, Pixie's again. I agree with both points. You're not actually authenticating the actual piece of software that the user is interacting with. All you're doing is proving that whatever they were using at the time was the same. The same piece. So, you started at the same point and you ended up back at the same piece of software. So to call it client authentication none is appropriate, because the client isn't authenticated at all. You don't actually know which website is actually being used, because it could be any piece of software that's been reverse engineered, or anything client that somebody's decided to build for them, for themselves. It's an unauthenticated app running essentially in an untrusted user domain and space. So if that's not important to you, and certainly when you look at some of the more secure data sharing ecosystems, you never trust any form of application that's running in the client domain, because hey, it can be inspected, reverse engineered, anything where the client identifiers and all client authentication mechanisms are essentially public. You can never be confident that your customer is actually interacting or utilizing your particular piece of software or your particular website. Anyone can reverse engineer a public client with authentication mechanism of none, spoof and the redirect URIs if they own that, compromised or otherwise choose to reverse engineer your website. So I do agree with both points in that it's not authenticated. You've got no idea what client it was, but whatever client it was that was being used with Pixie, you should have reasonable confidence that at least they come back to the same point that they started with. And if they choose to start with a client that wasn't the one that you would expect, you'd have no way of knowing.
So we have a better way to do this now, right? To authenticate clients. I mean, or maybe I should go back to the current state. When developers are calling an API, as we pointed out, they could authenticate directly to that API, but in OAuth, we like the pattern that the client authenticates at an authorization server, obtains a token, and then presents that token to the API. And so I feel like we've moved client authentication to the AS, which is a good thing. The current state, though, for how clients get tokens is typically a client ID and secret. And an OpenID defines a couple of ways they can, they can use basic authentication, they can post, they can use a JWT. As Nat points out, the JWT has one advantage in that it's signed, but these are still all using shared secrets. And so that is our current state. But is there a better way?
Forms of JWT, right? One where it's a shared secret and one where it's a private public signing key, right? Back to your slide, yeah.
Yeah, so go back to Nat's.
Yeah.
So I think what we're saying.
And a private key jot.
Right. So, there's two different JWTs. So this client secret jot, I guess we're sending the jot, but it's signed. And so that's better, I guess. I don't see this used a lot in practice.
Well, if you're going to go and do a jot, then why not go all the way to a private key jot versus a client secret jot?
Exactly. Yeah. But, so this diagram was presented by Nat, and 2017, and it's 2024, 7 years later. And I feel like, when I first saw this diagram, I thought, oh, well, this will help us talk to developers and help them understand why it's important to move away from shared secrets. But in practice, that really hasn't happened. Um, can you, Ralph, just maybe address in higher assurance ecosystems, what's the alternative to the shared secrets, to client ID and secrets?
Sure. So, first I'd start, challenging the assertion that it hasn't happened yet. It may not have happened at the widespread ubiquity across every single data sharing or API server interaction, but it's certainly happening, and it's certainly happening at pace. So ecosystems that are leveraging the FAPI security profile are becoming almost too numerous to count. So data sharing ecosystems, including Open Banking Brazil, Open Banking UK, the Australian consumer data right, Open Insurance in Brazil, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's data sharing ecosystem, and this one, the UAE, as well as FTX's own security profile. And as you start getting developers using, and companies and more organizations using data sharing ecosystems that do and actually mandate high security and high assurance authentication mechanisms, and outright ban public clients in favor of strong private clients, you are seeing the developer tooling come along for that that ride. So in Australia, there's now there's multiple SDKs that have been published, and there's multiple libraries that are now available that make a lot of these original technical challenges and objections that developers used to raise sort of start disappearing. And that is rapidly moving down the technology and also the industry implementation curve. So what you started, with where you had data sharing ecosystems where you would have implementations that were only open finance and highly assured, which required initially a reasonable amount of technology skill sets to utilize, as the standards, libraries, vendor support, and also the understanding of what it takes to build a secure API channel, and the risks that are, have now very clearly been called out, are, acknowledged by CISOs and CTOs for anyone that's building data sharing ecosystems. It's starting to become very hard to not do this properly, to not actually address these, these security requirements when it comes to the API channel. Now, you've seen around the world, everyone want to get rid of usernames and passwords. Big push for stronger authentication mechanisms for individuals, and that's really no different for stronger, the push now for stronger authentication mechanisms for API keys. And so that's happened in sort of stages. Firstly, you started with the national data sharing ecosystems like Open Finance or the Australian Consumer Data Right, which is covering every sector and every industry, eventually in Australia saying, no, you've all got to implement a very strong security bar. Then being adopted by consortiums that also say, actually, I've got together and I'm a member of this strong, highly secure data sharing ecosystem, so I'm going to require my clients to use the same bar for accessing my discretionary APIs. And that now moving into enterprise, where a large number of enterprises are requiring the same security capabilities and the same security standards and expectations for their developers. And that doesn't come without its challenges, because you do end up with a bit of a yin and yang and a bit of a pushback sometimes from API product owners or API channel owners that really are concerned about the developer user experience, and they're less concerned about security because they just want to get customers in the door. And the easiest way it used to, and the messaging that used to come from these people were, I'm happy to take the security risks. I'm happy to give API keys and secrets. I don't care about tokens being stolen. I don't care about breach of access. I don't care about data loss because a TPP or a relying party's done the wrong thing. And that's changing rapidly. GDPR was one of the big input drivers for this. No one can take the risk anymore for data loss from poor and weak API security channels. But now that the API security community has formally called out all of the risks for the use of non-token bound and symmetric API security mechanisms, it's not something ecosystems or anyone can ignore anymore. So from my perspective, I'm certainly seeing a big push towards private key JOT, but it started top down as opposed to bottom up, where the, let's call it the social media type or large cloud providers are interested in ratcheting up security. That's not quite happened yet, but it's certainly happened from top down in terms of either national governments or data sharing ecosystems in the regulated space, setting the standard from which other industry players, even for their own APIs, security standards, are then choosing to adopt it.
So do you
Dick, maybe
think it's something that's going to happen
comment.
in? I was going to play co-host and ask questions too.
Sure, go ahead. Let's hear it.
So do you see that signed JOTs are something that's going to be picked up by the major social providers? Google, Apple, Microsoft.
Microsoft already supports signed JOTs for private key authentication for their Azure identity stack and their Azure platform. They also support certificate-based authentication. So it's already happened for the Microsoft integrations. We haven't seen much movement yet for Azure. AWS has been using a form of signed JOT for authentication or signed request, authenticated request headers internally when you're accessing AWS services. So I don't see this being a big leap yet for other clients, operating, or other cloud providers operating this as just as a standard. What will be interesting is when you start seeing enterprises that are leveraging these cloud-hosted services start demanding the same level of security or the same assurance level for accessing these services as they come to expect from accessing either their own internal services because they operate at a higher security standard, or when they're accessing other services. So it'll be interesting to see if the big cloud service providers jump before they're pushed. But either way, I can't see them remaining without sort of these sort of capabilities for long, especially considering some of them, like Google, who are operating Google Pay, are already operating as fintechs in some of these regulated markets. So they're already consuming and interacting with these services that operate a higher standard of security themselves. So it'd sort of be nonsensical if it's not on their roadmap and radars already.
I just wanted to.
You're conflating API access and AS authentication as well, right? Because private signed JOT is a mechanism for how you authenticate to the AS. It's not a mechanism for how you authenticate to an API.
Great question. And it's a great call out for there. So there's, as you mentioned, and we were talking about this earlier, the two for authenticated to the API, there are three standards, and they all come with their problems and they all come with their sort of developer challenges. So again, in the regulated space, there are predominantly at the moment two mechanisms that are utilized, and we're again seeing this being rolled out for the discretionary APIs particularly in financial services, which are operating FAPI grade security usually using private key JOT, but with MTLS for token binding. That's put a little bit of is often cited as a technical challenge for developers, but actually in reality, now that it's there are services and capabilities out there that allow developers to instantly obtain a mutual TLS cert for token binding. A lot of the challenges for developers were really about obtaining appropriate transport certificates. That capability is now ubiquitous and is usually offered by large enterprises instantly. So the ability to obtain certificates for that purpose was the primary challenge and is now largely gone away. The second one is, and that is most widely present, is for some highly secure data sharing ecosystems, and both regulated and non-regulated, banks and financial services are requesting that some of the messages be signed directly. So in addition to them being a RESTful API call, they're either accompanying that with a signed signature, either using HTTP SIGs or some other mechanism to prove proof of possession, but also message authentication integrity. That's a very common pattern that's now being rolled out. And then also in some ecosystems, they're just out and out just requiring the messages to be in a JWT format rather than a JSON format. So Brazil leverages that. So do several major implementations inside in the Middle East. The third one, and we touched on this in our call, was Depop. So the obtaining a distributed proof of possession access token, and then signing or confirming that proof of possession whenever you're accessing a resource. Now, Depop hasn't been widely adopted, and yet. However, given the rise of verifiable credentials and the massive amount of work that's going on in the EU to roll out the digital ID infrastructure as part of EIDAS 2, which essentially is going to rely on wallets talking to resource servers all over the place to be able to obtain credentials and present those credentials. They can't leverage mutual TLS. So Depop is looking like the default version for accessing those credential issuance APIs, and there are thousands upon thousands of credential issuer types scattered across Europe, and this is now a mandated program from the European Union where every country and every anyone that wants to use or issue or play in the what is going to be the booming digital identity space is going to need to be supporting Depop issued access tokens, but also being able to validate Depop issued or Depop bound bearer tokens. So again, what might be going on in the United States is but one part of the market, and the rest of the world is rapidly moving towards not just using but requiring these more modern forms of token binding as part of major government initiatives.
I think it might be helpful for our audience if we just quickly go over what the ask is for developers. So currently, for a developer to obtain a token, they basically go to the developer portal. They create a client, usually through the portal. They create a client ID and secret. They copy that secret from into their clipboard, and they paste it into application, normally in clear text. Frequently, I see these in clear text in JSON files or YAML files, and then their app basically uses those credentials to obtain a token, and that's pretty easy. 4 steps. They ask for us to move to a private key authentication. Is first the developer generates a key pair and stores it in something like a P12 key store.
What's a P12 key store?
This is Java stuff. I don't know. Maybe there's different, key store formats. This is what we use at Glue.
But what is that?
It's equivalent of a PO. It's just PFX. So it's a way. It's a key store where you can stick public and private keys and protect it with a password.
Okay. So what would they do if they're programming a node?
That's a great question. And if we're going to talk to the developers, the node ecosystem has a real, problem, particularly when you're wanting to use and perform MTLS natively. So, but if you're using Depop when you're using Node, you can very easily use remote signing services
I just going back to step 1 here that Mike's calling out, and it's like, okay, well, one, I don't even know what a P12 file is. I code in Node, and it's like, okay, so what am I going to do? I'm going to generate these things, and then what?
Well, then
you're going to output it as a JWKS. That's actually not trivial. You'll need this JWKS during dynamic client registration, because you'll need to either send it as a param or store it somewhere and make it accessible via URL.
Right. And going back to your other criticism of like, oh, I'm just going to go and keep my secret in plain text, right? Like, are they going to put their private key in plain text? Like, how have you really improved security if the private key is just part of the script, just like the other? Like, you haven't. There's a whole thing around how do you manage your secrets. That's kind of an important part of this.
Yeah, that's a
fundamental. And I wanted to bring that up because I said key store file here, but you're right. Maybe you put that in the properties in the JSON or YAML itself, which wouldn't be great. But this sort of has an assumption that we're an organization that knows how to do secrets management And based on the number of crypto thefts out there, it seems like people have a really hard time protecting keys.
Well, I'd argue that actually a lot of organizations don't even perform this, don't even try to protect their keys. But increasingly, the obligation and burden is just going to be pushed onto those entities. And what we certainly find, is that as organizations go through the growth and maturity curve, is that this becomes untenable for the CISO or the data protection officer who's carrying the risk that these keys are compromised. So yes, it might be very easy to go and run an OpenSSL command and dump out a CSR and a private key on a user's box or a process box and just read it. But if you look at all of the security policies that these organizations are supposed to be operating under, particularly any that are ISO 27001 certified, which is becoming de rigueur for anyone engaging in the API economy, key management and key management practices are a required part of that security standard. So increasingly, you are looking at leveraging remote signing services for this, and it's not hard. So in Node, if you are a security conscious developer, you can simply say to AWS with a one-line command, create me an RSA KMS key, and then with another one-line command, say, sign me a JOT, please. And so understanding how you can use remote signing services like AWS KMS or Google KMS or Microsoft Key Vault is something that the industry does need to develop more skills with, and there does need to be more education and fundamental type training for developers about how to leverage secure key management services, but in a way that's very cost effective. Because again, traditionally, before you had cloud managed signing services, you would have to have spun up a cloud-based hardware security modules for resiliency yourselves, which are very expensive, require lots of people to stand around singing Kumbaya as they do commissioning ceremony for the certificates. But again, the technology for signing a JOT using an AWS KMS key is 2 lines in Node.js. And again, it's just as easy and as simpler in Golang. And there are plenty of libraries out there about how to do this properly. I say how to do this properly. What you find when you've got developers that are just starting out is they really want to do it extremely quickly, and properly doesn't enter the equation until many months later, and they have to go back and fix or actually implement key management processes because their CISO or their data protection officer or their pen test or their audit and compliance requirements have said, actually, you can't continue offering building your product because you've got very weak and very insecure key management practices. So what I would say for the industry is that the industry needs to understand that you can do this properly and you can do this quickly. And we need to get better as an industry in communicating how to do it properly and quickly in multiple languages so that you don't end up with these, increasingly intolerable risks for developers, but also the API provider that they're carrying if they, don't help and don't enable and don't actually set an appropriate security bar for their clients and participants.
Okay, so let's say it's possible for us to easily sign something and we can figure out how to protect the keys. Performing dynamic client registration is easier said than done. The way that ecosystems like open banking handle the trust in this is by using software statements. So controlling how you actually allow clients to register is maybe more complicated than you're letting on. Can you talk about some of the challenges around now that we're really going to use asymmetric secrets, we're going to require registration? What challenges does that bring?
Well, DCR doesn't require the use of software statements at all. This is down to the
Right.
this is authorization server's policy. So if an authorization server wants to allow anyone to register a client and the actual user behind that or the developer behind that registration can be unauthenticated and they're happy to do that, well, that's post
It's not
an
very
API.
useful though, in a way.
Well,
it might be useful for something like Pixie, right? Where I'm not authenticating anyway. So I quickly get a client ID and then I
Can I jump in there? Because I don't think Pixie is just not authenticated, right?
Not giving up on this.
No, I'm not. No, I mean, I worked on these things. So there is an aspect around, if you're in a web flow, right, that, the browser, if you're saying that the browser's been compromised, right, that's a whole different attack vector, right? But assuming the browser hasn't, I'm trying to move around so I'm in the center of the screen. If you assume that the browser's, safe and everything's there, well, the browser is only going to redirect to the URI that was there. And so the AS can say, well, is that one or the redirect URI that you're allowed to go to? And so that, somebody can't just go and pretend to be your client, assuming, that everything isn't compromised. And so you do know which client it was because only that client has that redirect URI and can only respond to that redirect URI. I bring this up because we wanted to lower the friction at Hello for people to get up and running, which reminds me of another part. We're conflating a whole different set of developers, right? So Ralph's talking about, high risk, moving money around, right? Like you want to know and have more confidence about that. But most people don't have, they're not needing financial grade API protection. And, but they also shouldn't go and have an open door that anybody can walk in and steal all their stuff. So in Hello, we made it so that you don't have to have a client secret to go and use Hello because, we make you use Pixie and we make it be a registered URI. So we do know which client it is. And that dramatically lowers the friction on somebody being able to get up and running with Hello. That, we actually have a little flow that you don't have to go over to the console and register your app. We'll do a bunch of that dynamically and just a little, script bouncing you around, and you can have a client up and running, and it is secure. Now,
yeah. So if you've implemented and registered your redirect your URIs, but coming back to Mike's point, is that if you've got a portal where you're going to be able to go and register your redirect URIs, Mike, then I wouldn't be doing DCR for the client. To Dick's point, I'd simply be saying, please upload your public key. Thanks very much. I've registered your client. Here you go. Job done. Here's your client ID. Add your redirect URIs, and the client doesn't have to do anything. The authorization server can host that key for them. They don't need to worry about creating or munging JWKS URIs or anything like that. And that's certainly what our platform does, because for some reason, turning a PEM file into a properly formatted JWKS and hosting it was seen to be a challenge. But again, it's not it isn't a barrier anymore, because there are platforms like what Raidiam offers, which enables all of those what used to be complex security requirements to be handled in a one-click type manner. But back to Dick's point, if you use Pixie and you have got somehow where somebody's registering and managing their redirect URIs, then that's fine. You're relying on essentially infrastructure and browser and host-based security to sort of to tie that down. And in that model, that public client, you can have a degree of trust on it. It doesn't meet the requirements of the threat model that's been created by the OpenID Foundation FAPI working group, and there are still theoretical attacks against that, and that's one of the big challenges. As soon as you point out threat vectors that are unmitigated here, increasingly they're just becoming intolerable to enterprises to be continuing carrying those threats. And as I said previously, it may not be a major issue yet for some enterprises, but it's certainly across the pond and across the ditch, as we say in New Zealand and Australia, is becoming a risk. But I will challenge that point also in that it's difficult to just get up and running. So there's an ecosystem in Australia run by Australian Payments Plus called Connect ID. Connect ID isn't moving money. Connect ID is using the banks to provide just digital identity capabilities for Australian citizens and consumers. And they are also leveraging the FAPI2. Now, the way the great thing about the financial grade API version 2 protocol is it's actually very simple. It's comparatively to FAPI 1. It cuts down a lot of the additional requirements and becomes a very slim sort of profile. And there are a number of libraries out there that implement this. And ConnectID publish a number of SDKs in multiple different languages that allows a developer to take it, plug in their certs, and go. Then from memory, the time, the timescales for getting up and running using FAPI in a highly secure data sharing ecosystem is less than an hour for developers. Now, this ecosystem is being rolled out to industries everywhere in Australia. It's not just banks, it's not just fintechs, it's your local liquor shop, it's your local supermarkets, it's your local it's even your government services. And the fact that that is being used at speed and at pace by developers of all sizes and shapes and by industries of all sizes and shapes and is being rolled out successfully, again, for me, just lends credence to actually how much the industry has moved on than the developer experience has moved on when, countering some of these, original arguments where this is hard. And yeah, some of it is hard if you're coding from first principles, but there are some great libraries out there.
1 hour experience that a developer can have.
Okay, so yeah, that's not a problem. And I think the actual time to onboard, if you really know what you're doing, then you're using a federation control plane. It is actually in minutes.
So the starting point is I am at my desk, and I would like to participate in writing a piece of code. You guys on my desktop. Right.
Yep. Cool. So if you want to, so the starting point for at least engaging, we'll leave the key management practices, out for now, because that will vary significantly based on your organization policies and whether or not you're cloud native.
I'm giving you my example. I'm a 2-person company. I'm using AWS. Right.
Yep. Okay. You're a 2-person company.
The key management is actually one of the hard things that we're saying that we need to make it easy for people. So I'm thinking it'd be great if we can talk through why is that easier? I mean, even the client secret is a huge friction. Going to a console and registering your app at Google or Apple is hours of effort just to register your app.
Yeah, so we're in our platform. So if anyone's familiar, Raidiam provides essentially the app store or the federation control plane that sits at the heart of data sharing ecosystems in Brazil, AP plus, a couple of countries in the Middle East, as well as a capability that's used by enterprise to make what you're talking about here as simple, as seamless as possible. So using our capability, fintechs are able to register their apps, create their certificates and keys, which are hosted by that platform, and they can do so either via API or by clicky in just a matter of minutes. The record from an app being able to be generated and created was by one of our engineers is about, I think it was 90 seconds. If you know exactly which buttons to click and how to upload your CSRs.
Managing the private key for them, or
no, it doesn't manage the private key, but it manages all the key distribution, key creation, certificate generation, basically everything you normally would have in a federated model distributed amongst.
So they go to your console, click through, they click a few things, and then they get a private key, and then what do? They got a private key.
Yeah, so as part of that, it creates the full client, so they can register, they can upload their logos, they can set their descriptions, they can set their redirect URIs, they can set every single property that a client needs to engage in a data sharing ecosystem. And then on the other side, you've got authorization servers that are plugged in.
I'm focusing more on the key part, right? Like the logo and stuff like that is OAuth, console 101 stuff. The key part is what you're doing differently. So I'm just curious. So I've got the key. What format's the key?
It'll be in PEM.
Okay.
But it depends. But again, it depends on the policy. So there are instructions for how to create a key pair on AWS, which is a one-line AWS CLI command to generate a KMS key, which will output.
I've had no problem. I've generated many key pairs. Yeah. Ironically, my
formerly worked at
AWS key pairs is I go to an online service and do it because it's actually a lot easier than trying to run a command.
Well, we give the command if you want to be running, just getting up and running from literally an OpenSSL command to, to
Right.
generate it, generate locally.
But the generating the key pairs is usually not the hard part.
Sure, and then from then you can download a number of SDKs that have got various different hooks into either pointing at an AWS KMS key or pointing to a key file locally if you're pulling it down from a from wherever to read into memory and in process. And then there are 4 or 5 different financial grade API certified libraries, and they come with both a client and a server. Capability as a reference implementation for accessing resources.
If it's an AWS, if I'm using AWS KMS and I need to generate my key pair with AWS KMS.
Yeah, correct. And there's a command that says generate your AWS KMS. It'll output the public key, and you upload the public key to the platform. It does all of the JWKS URI hosting and the conversion of that into a JWKS URI, and then the libraries, the certified libraries for private key JOT. Philip Skoken's got a great one from a node point of view, which allows you to use AWS. Can be made to use AWS with KMS for the creation of a JOT for token endpoint authentication. Go is even simpler from using an AWS KMS crypt signer. Module, and there's several open source projects that have them for AWS, Google, and Microsoft. And dropping for any Go developer out there, just dropping in and swapping a crypto interface from local read a key pair to remote do a key signing is now very well documented. But it does require a degree of understanding that's one step up above from Postman. So if you're talking about developers that are Postman's your starting point, where it's very easy to go and say insert copy paste, and that's your starting point for users, then there is a learning curve. But my point here is that learning curve is a lot less than it used to be 5 years ago when these ecosystems were kicking around, and the industry collectively has an objective to make this as simple as possible and as secure as possible for participants.
So I had a question about Connect ID. How do the participants get vetted? So I write an application.
Yeah, that's entirely out of scope. So anyone that's using our ecosystem control plane, that's entirely up to them in terms of their onboarding and accreditation processes. There is support now for OpenID Connect for Federation in terms of automatic onboarding for and walking the Federation trust chains for relying party onboarding. Again, Federation, OIDC Federation is becoming is still niche, but is becoming looked at significantly by a number of different players for cross-border client management to enable federations of trust to start trusting each other for client registration. So the Italians use it extensively. It's used in the Nordics, and I'm pretty confident that a form of it will be used as part of EIDAS too, to try and stitch together all of these different trust anchors and trust routes together. But it's the actual initial accreditation of the participant is out of band in the same way it is for Open Banking UK or any of these other ecosystems. The organization.
Let's actually show Open Banking UK, because I have a quick picture of it. This is a sample software statement assertion, a document I'm sure you've seen, familiar with, Ralph. And I like how it shows very clearly in this SSA that was issued that it comes with authorizations, with roles. And I think this gets back to maybe my question about dynamic client registration, which is, yeah, we can do it without SSAs, but with SSAs, we can have more control over how much we actually trust this client that's registering and carefully registering its keys. How useful is DCR without presenting some type of assertion that tells you what the
really,
trust
because
I kind of wonder how useful is DCR anyway? Like what's the use case for DCR?
So the use case for DCR is when you've got multiple authorization servers that are relying on an external trust anchor. However, that's DCR is being replaced and has been replaced in the Australian ecosystem for Connect ID with something that is more akin to OpenID Connect Federation,
Right.
pushing the obligation onto relying parties to register and maintain their registration at banks is fine when you've got a small number of relying parties and a large number of banks. But when you have very large ecosystems of relying parties and a small number of banks, as most ecosystems grow to, actually it makes far more sense for the authorization server to be registered, to be managing that client registration by a process akin to OIDC Federation or some other capability. And we support.
I'm a big fan of OIDC Federation because that's still a registration, right? It's not DCR.
Yeah, correct. Well, OIDC Fed supports explicit registration, which is akin to, to dynamic client registration. But you're talking about the more common pattern, either just in time or out of band registration, where authorization servers are essentially syncing with the federation controller that they are part of. And yeah, that is the pattern that Australia uses. Then we fully support that as a pattern, and it's also the pattern that we now actively encourage ecosystems to use from the off. Now, again, it's always a bit of a challenge when you're dealing with these ecosystems, because you're talking about making authorization servers a la banks do a little bit more work, and you're taking that work away from the relying party. But actually, it significantly, in the long run, significantly simplifies the ecosystem management and simplifies the life of the relying party if they don't have to worry about registration at all. And again, that's exactly what we're seeing, where the relying party registration, once they've added, they've registered their app once to a federation controller, added or uploaded their keys, is automatically registered to and onboarded to all members of the authorization servers in the federation. Because
but there's a big delta between registering once and registering zero, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a big delta between registering once and registering zero. As you said earlier, I'm not sure how useful naked registration with no authentication of who's actually registering.
Right, which was what Mike was talking about. So DCR is like, okay, well, you're not, particularly if it's a financial institution, it's not going to just let any random app start talking to it, right? They might make.
I also.
Go ahead.
Just to add to that, I also have trouble with OpenID Federation because I don't really see it out there. It seems like a good idea. It's on like draft 50, and we haven't actually. I don't know of any OpenID federations. I know of some experimental ones in education. Maybe I'm not following closely enough, but it sounds like a great idea. But it is really out.
Right, the Italians have got a big implementation for OpenID Connect Fed, and yes, the where you'll see federation be used first will be where it was originally designed, which was for mainly identity sharing. You've seen that resource specifications and resource discovery is only a recent addition to OIDF Fed, as ecosystems that operate mainly data sharing ecosystems like open banking and open finance start to recognize that they can use the same capabilities and concepts as defined in OIDF Fed. Now, these concepts aren't new. Barclays in the United Kingdom, even with open banking, does a synchronization of the open banking directory using its APIs. It's just not using, implemented in what would be recognized as an international standard. But those services have been made available in those federation control capabilities for authorization servers to do that synchronization since day one. I added that right from the off and was encouraging authorization servers to remove that burden from those fintechs right from day one. It just, as you said, there wasn't a standardized way of doing this simply. Now, Fed still has its problems. It's relatively complex for what you're trying to achieve. So again, in our capability, in our federation controller, we support Fed, but also a number of different other mechanisms for allowing authorization servers to achieve that same objective, which is to lower the barrier for relying parties to operate at a high security level. And that's really the objective for all of us, is to raise the bar, but without doing it in a way that's punishing of people for being able to access these services, or do it otherwise impede customers' conversions of their API consumer clients.
And I guess maybe, well, we're coming towards the end of the, I don't want to go over an hour, we're at about 50 minutes. But maybe that is the question. What is the bar? And is this a bar for only a certain type of application that needs high level assurance, like bank apps or fintechs? And what should we be telling API developers, maybe our normal API developers, if we want to see them do something better than what they're doing today? Like, how can we move the bar forward a little bit without increasing the friction maybe as much as some of the things we've talked about? And
Yeah,
because
it's
I
a
don't
great
know
one.
what that's going to take.
No, it's a great one. And so I think Connect ID in Oz have really started that, or have continued that ball rolling by creating SDKs and improving libraries. And I think we just generally need to do this. I mean, this also applied at the authorization server. For many years, Keycloak was not FAPI certified, so there was a major open source authorization server that wasn't FAPI compliant. The community came together and did that. Glue also had to do their upgrade to FAPI. As the industry demands higher grades of security, the industry usually responds, and the open source industry is the thing that responds first. So by encouraging and actively contributing to the libraries for this, we can certainly make it far simpler for relying parties to just get started. And it should also be recognized that, like other elements of this, is that accessing a FAPI or secure data sharing data grade API is not really USP. It is an open standard, and there are a number of different libraries available here. And so again, what used to happen 5 years ago was TPPs or relying parties would invest significantly in building out their own connectivity solutions, and they started trying to sell that as a capability. Increasingly, that's just not flying anymore. And actually, those with same relying parties want to be able to consume simple library-based capabilities to get to solve that connectivity problem, so they can concentrate on value-added services. So for me, the ask is the same as it's always been: is that the open source community needs to be continually improving and making it simpler for developers to be operating at a higher standard and higher bar. And anyone that's launching or considering creating these ecosystems should be actively contributing to those libraries. Yeah.
Dick, any last thoughts? How do we help developers call APIs more securely?
Well, they're going to use whatever the auth server provides, right? And I think there's a piece we're missing here, which is that an awful lot of development for APIs is all first party, right? A lot of people just roll their own stuff. It's all within the same company, and following a good security practice of separation of concerns, separation of duties, right? They'll run their own authorization server, which will mint tokens for them to use against their own app. And so those aren't visible too much. And frankly, I think that JWT signing is probably way too heavy for those things, as to how do you're not trying to prove that you're the client to a third party. It's all software within the same place, and you've got a separation around what mints tokens versus what uses tokens. We kind of skipped over differentiating between, just like we've merged sort of all developers together and all kind of API calls together, we also merged all the clients together, right? So there's a huge difference in securing, making an API call from a web app versus a native app on a phone versus, an app on a native app on a Windows machine, right? The security parameters around there are right different. There's some super interesting work happening now around device-bound cookies, around how to bind the cookie to the device versus it just being a bearer token. Moving your access token to a cookie means that, cross-site scripting risks are much lower, because some other script running in the app can't go and steal the access token and exfiltrate it. And so if you have an HTTP only cookie, it can't be exfiltrated by cross-site scripting, but it can still be exfiltrated by a malware running on the user's machine that can look at files and find the cookies, or a malware browser extension that's able to go and look at the transport. And so the work around the device-bound cookies looks super interesting and helps solve that security issue, which is really how do we secure a web client calling an API.
When I put the birds on, it's a sign that we're coming to an end.
That's good.
Before we end, I just want to make a quick pitch for Internet Identity Workshop 38, which is coming up next week. There's a discount code, which you see below, authc_38 in lower numbers _20. This will get you 20% off. It's a discount code from Phil Windley, who'll be a guest in a couple of episodes coming up. So I want to thank my guests. Thank you, Ralph, so much for joining us today, getting up early.
Thanks, Mike.
And thanks, Dick, for asking a lot of hard questions as normal and
Thanks,
providing
Dick.
your insights.
Okay, good to see you guys. Thank you.
Okay, and thanks to the audience for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.